If you want someone to blame, blame the intern, Ethan Mercer said as he pointed toward the wall of monitors. The words cut through the operations center like a cold wind. Dozens of employees turned at once. Every eye landed on Alyssa Brooks. The 23-year-old intern sat alone at the far end of the room, surrounded by glowing screens, empty coffee cups, and pages of handwritten notes. For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sounds came from server alerts echoing softly through the room and the steady hum of cooling systems behind reinforced glass walls. The company headquarters occupied 20 floors of a downtown technology tower, and on that Thursday morning, panic seemed to be spreading faster than information. Red warning messages flashed across multiple displays. Customer services were slowing down. Internal systems were behaving unpredictably. Executives moved quickly between conference rooms, while engineers rushed from desk to desk, trying to understand what was happening. Ethan stood near the center of the operations floor, his expensive suit jacket draped over one arm. At 54, he had built a reputation as a decisive leader. Investors admired him because he acted quickly. Employees respected him because he projected certainty. But certainty and accuracy were not always the same thing. Earlier that morning, security footage had shown Alyssa entering a restricted server area several times during the night. Someone had noticed unusual activity logs connected to her credentials. Then the network problems intensified. To Ethan, the conclusion seemed obvious. She was in the server room, one executive said quietly. More than once. Ethan nodded. Exactly. Alyssa slowly looked up from her workstation. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes. Her curly hair was tied back loosely. She looked exhausted, as though she had not slept properly in days. In truth, she had not. Yet despite the attention focused on her, she remained surprisingly calm. Ethan stepped closer. Would you like to explain why our systems started failing after you gained access? Several employees shifted uncomfortably. The question sounded less like an invitation and more like a verdict. Alyssa glanced toward the largest monitor in the room. Lines of data continued scrolling across the display. Then she looked back at Ethan. Did anyone check the attack logs? She asked quietly. The room fell silent. Ethan frowned. That is not what I asked. Alyssa nodded. I know. Her answer only seemed to frustrate him further. Our network is unstable. Customers are reporting issues. Investors are calling. And your credentials appear everywhere. Alyssa folded her hands. Did anyone check the attack logs? She repeated. Nobody answered. Several engineers exchanged uncertain looks. A few appeared to recognize the question's importance. But under the pressure of the crisis, nobody wanted to challenge the CEO. Ethan crossed his arms. Security is reviewing everything. Alyssa looked back toward her screens. Then they are looking in the wrong place. A murmur moved through the room. Ethan's expression hardened. To him, her calmness looked suspicious. What he could not see was that Alyssa had spent the last 72 hours tracking something far more dangerous than a simple system failure. And while everyone around her was searching for someone to blame, nobody had yet discovered what she had actually been fighting alone. Alyssa Brooks had stopped caring about the clock sometime during the previous night. The digital display above the operations floor now showed 10:14 in the morning, but to her it could have been any hour of any day. The bright office lights, the endless stream of alerts, and the constant glow of monitors had blended together into a single exhausting blur. While executives rushed through hallways discussing public relations concerns and system outages, Alyssa remained focused on the data moving across her screens. She knew something nobody else seemed willing to consider. The strange activity affecting the company was not random. It was coordinated. 3 days earlier, she had noticed a small irregularity buried inside routine network traffic. At first it looked harmless. Most analysts would have ignored it. But Alyssa had spent years teaching herself how to recognize patterns. Growing up, she had turned old computers into learning projects. She watched tutorials late into the night, studied network security forums, and solved technical challenges simply because she enjoyed understanding how systems worked. When she earned an internship at one of the country's fastest-growing technology firms, she arrived determined to prove herself. Instead, she quickly discovered that interns were often overlooked. Their observations rarely reached decision-makers. Their warnings rarely received attention. 3 nights ago, Alyssa had submitted a report describing suspicious activity. The report received no response. 12 hours later, she submitted another. Then another. Each one contained more evidence than the last. Each one showed unusual login attempts, abnormal traffic patterns, and repeated efforts to reach protected systems. Yet the reports disappeared into crowded inboxes while executives focused on quarterly presentations and investor meetings. So Alyssa made a decision. If nobody else was watching, she would. She stayed late after her shift ended. Then she stayed through the night. Then she returned the next morning without going home. She bought snacks from vending machines. She drank too much coffee. She tracked alerts that appeared and disappeared across different regions of the network. Every hour brought another clue. Every clue pointed toward the same conclusion. Someone was testing the company's defenses. Back in the operations center, Ethan Mercer continued speaking with security personnel. Several managers gathered around a conference table reviewing activity reports. Nobody invited Alyssa into the discussion. Nobody asked what she had been doing for the past 72 hours. They simply saw an exhausted intern whose credentials appeared throughout the system logs. From a distance, the evidence looked suspicious. Up close, it told a different story. Alyssa opened another monitoring window and quietly studied a series of timestamps. Her eyes narrowed. There it was again. The same pattern. The same digital fingerprints she had been tracking for days. Someone was still trying to get inside. She glanced toward the executives arguing across the room. Then back to the screen. If they had checked the attack logs, they would have seen everything. The warnings. The blocked access attempts. The emergency countermeasures. Most importantly, they would have seen one name attached to nearly every defensive action taken during the last 3 days. Alyssa Brooks. But nobody had looked yet. And as another alert silently appeared in the corner of her monitor, she realized the real crisis might only be beginning. By noon, the operations center felt less like a corporate office and more like a pressure chamber. Large screens displayed system performance metrics while executives moved between emergency meetings carrying tablets and printed reports. Every few minutes another alert appeared somewhere in the network. Some were minor, others were not. Yet despite the growing urgency, most of the leadership team remained focused on a single theory. Alyssa Brooks had somehow caused the problem. Ethan Mercer stood inside a glass conference room overlooking the operations floor. From there he could see engineers gathered around workstations and managers speaking in tense voices. He preferred clear answers. The problem was that clear answers were becoming harder to find. The evidence against Alyssa seemed convincing at first glance. Her credentials appeared throughout security records. She had entered restricted areas multiple times. She had modified system settings. She had created emergency access rules. But every time investigators examined one piece of evidence, another question appeared. Why would someone trying to damage the network also create protective safeguards? Why would someone trying to hide their actions submit multiple reports describing suspicious activity before the crisis became public? The contradictions were beginning to accumulate. Across the room, Alyssa remained focused on her monitors. She barely noticed the conversations around her anymore. Her attention was locked on patterns moving through streams of incoming data. The same digital fingerprints continued appearing across different systems. They vanished, reappeared, shifted locations, then returned again. Whoever was behind the activity was persistent. More importantly, they were patient. Alyssa opened another report and compared timestamps. Her eyes narrowed immediately. The pattern had changed. Not dramatically, just enough to matter. She quickly typed several commands and began reviewing traffic records from earlier that morning. A nearby engineer glanced toward her screen. "What are you looking at?" he asked quietly. Alyssa hesitated. She had spent 3 days trying to explain her concerns. Most people had ignored them. "Something familiar," she replied. Before the engineer could ask another question, a new alert appeared on one of the central displays. Several managers turned toward the screen. Ethan immediately exited the conference room. Conversations stopped. Employees gathered around the monitor. The alert showed unusual activity targeting customer authentication systems. The room grew tense. Ethan looked toward the security team. "Why are we seeing this now?" Nobody answered immediately. Then one analyst pointed toward a sequence of blocked access attempts. These requests were denied automatically. Ethan frowned. By what? The analyst scrolled through several records. Confusion appeared on his face. Then he looked up. By rules that were created 2 days ago. Ethan folded his arms. Who created them? The analyst continued reading. Around the room, people waited. Finally, he spoke. Alyssa Brooks. Silence followed. Several employees exchanged surprised looks. Ethan's expression hardened rather than softened. To him, the answer created more questions than solutions. Meanwhile, Alyssa watched another screen fill with fresh warnings. The activity was accelerating. Whoever had been probing the company's defenses seemed to realize time was running out. Alyssa understood what that meant. The real test had not happened yet. Everything during the last 72 hours had only been preparation. And somewhere inside millions of lines of network activity, a clue remained hidden that could change the entire investigation if someone finally decided to look for it. The atmosphere inside the operations center continued growing heavier with each passing minute. Large displays flashed warnings while teams moved rapidly between workstations trying to understand why new anomalies kept appearing across the network. Yet despite the urgency, the conversation remained trapped in the same place. Most executives were still debating who caused the problem instead of asking why it was happening. Ethan Mercer stood near the central command table reviewing a stack of incident summaries. Every report seemed to generate more confusion than clarity. The evidence pointed in different directions. One moment it appeared someone inside the company had created unusual system rules. The next moment those same rules appeared to be preventing additional disruptions. Nothing fit together cleanly. Across the room, Alyssa Brooks remained focused on her monitors. She looked exhausted. 72 hours of near-constant work had left her eyes tired and her shoulders tense. Yet her attention never drifted from the screens. She was watching something unfold in real time, something few others even realized existed. A senior engineer approached her desk carrying a tablet. Unlike many of the executives, he seemed genuinely curious. "I reviewed some of the reports you submitted," he said quietly. Alyssa looked up. "Only some." The engineer nodded. "There were more than I expected." Alyssa gave a small smile. "There usually are." He studied one of her displays. Hundreds of entries streamed down the screen. Login attempts, access requests, system responses, timestamps. Most people would have seen meaningless data. Alyssa saw a story. The engineer pointed toward a series of highlighted entries. "These are the same addresses you flagged yesterday." Alyssa nodded. "And the day before." The engineer frowned. "Nobody escalated this." "I tried." Before he could respond, another alert sounded across the operations floor. Several employees immediately turned toward a central monitor. Ethan looked up as well. New warnings appeared across multiple systems at nearly the same moment. Conversations stopped. Managers gathered around the display. The timing felt too precise to be accidental. Alyssa stood from her chair for the first time in nearly an hour. She watched the incoming data carefully. Then her expression changed. Not fear. Recognition. The pattern she had been tracking for days was finally revealing itself. She walked toward the nearest analyst station and pointed at a section of the screen. "Compare those timestamps with the authentication records from yesterday." The analyst hesitated before doing exactly that. A few seconds later, his eyes widened. "They match." Another analyst joined him. Then another. Suddenly, people were no longer looking at Alyssa as a suspect. They were looking at the data she had been trying to show them. Ethan noticed the shift immediately. "What are you seeing?" he asked. Nobody answered right away. The analysts continued comparing records. More matches appeared. More connections surfaced. Each one led back to warnings Alyssa had already documented. Warnings that had gone largely ignored. The senior engineer slowly turned toward Ethan. "I think we have been asking the wrong question." Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" The engineer glanced toward Alyssa before looking back at the screen. "Instead of asking whether she caused this, we should be asking how she knew it was coming." And for the first time since the crisis began, the room started moving away from assumptions and toward the truth. The mood inside the operations center shifted in a way nobody could ignore. For the first time all day, employees were no longer staring at Alyssa Brooks because they suspected her. They were staring because the evidence was beginning to point somewhere entirely different. Analysts moved quickly between workstations comparing reports, timestamps, and security records. Every few minutes, another connection appeared. Every connection led back to warnings Alyssa had already documented. The room that had spent hours questioning her actions was now being forced to examine its own assumptions. Ethan Mercer watched the activity unfold with growing frustration. He wanted a simple answer. Instead, the deeper people investigated, the more complicated the situation became. "Show me exactly what you found," he said. One of the analysts projected several reports onto a large screen. Rows of data filled the display. Login attempts, access requests, automated defenses, emergency permissions. At first glance, the information looked overwhelming. Then the analyst highlighted a pattern. These events began 72 hours ago, he explained. Every major warning was identified before the system disruption started. Ethan folded his arms. And the analyst swallowed. The alerts were submitted through internal reporting channels. Another employee opened a separate document. Here are the reports. Ethan stared at the screen. The timestamps matched perfectly. One report, then another, each contained increasingly detailed warnings. Each described suspicious activity targeting critical systems. Each recommended immediate investigation. And every report carried the same name at the bottom. Alyssa Brooks. A quiet murmur spread across the room. The senior engineer stepped forward. She documented everything before the disruptions became visible. Ethan remained silent. The explanation did not fit the narrative he had accepted earlier. Across the room, Alyssa sat back down at her workstation. She looked exhausted. Her eyes remained fixed on a monitoring screen, while everyone else focused on her reports. The contrast was impossible to miss. She seemed less interested in defending herself than in tracking whatever continued moving through the network. Suddenly, another alert appeared. Several analysts turned toward the screen. Alyssa immediately stood. There, she said. The room fell quiet. She pointed toward a cluster of activity buried among thousands of entries. That pattern again. An analyst enlarged the display. More data appeared. Then more. Within seconds, multiple employees were comparing records. Their expressions changed almost immediately. The senior engineer leaned closer. These are coordinated. Another analyst nodded. And they never stopped. The realization spread through the room. While everyone had been debating responsibility, the activity Alyssa warned about was still happening. Ethan looked toward the central display. For the first time, uncertainty appeared on his face. The evidence no longer suggested someone destroying systems from inside the company. It suggested someone repeatedly trying to gain access from outside. Alyssa quietly opened a file containing 72 hours of observations. Hundreds of entries filled the screen. She had tracked everything. Every attempt. Every response. Every defensive measure. The senior engineer stared at the document. How long have you been monitoring this? Alyssa finally looked up. Since the first warning appeared. By yourself? Another analyst asked. Alyssa nodded. Silence followed. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then the senior engineer opened one final log file. The moment he saw what was inside, his expression changed completely. He turned toward Ethan and took a slow breath. You need to see this, he said. Because if these records are accurate, Alyssa was never the reason the company survived the last 3 days. The operations center grew unusually quiet. The constant conversations that had filled the room throughout the day slowly faded as employees gathered around the screen displaying the newly discovered records. Nobody seemed interested in speculation anymore. The data was finally beginning to tell its own story. Ethan Mercer stepped closer to the monitor while the senior engineer opened the file Alyssa had been building during the previous 72 hours. The document stretched across hundreds of pages. Timestamps, network activity, defensive actions, escalation attempts, detailed notes. Every entry revealed another piece of a puzzle nobody had bothered to assemble. The engineer slowly scrolled through the records. She documented everything, he said. Several analysts nodded in disbelief. The first warning had appeared 3 days earlier. Then another. Then dozens more. Alyssa had tracked every suspicious event as it moved across different parts of the network. She recorded unusual login attempts. She flagged abnormal traffic patterns. She identified vulnerabilities and implemented temporary safeguards while waiting for approval that never came. The room remained silent except for the soft clicking of keyboards. Ethan watched as page after page appeared on the screen. Every recommendation Alyssa submitted had a timestamp. Every report showed exactly when it was sent. More importantly, every report showed that nobody acted on it. Across the room, Alyssa sat quietly beside a wall of monitors glowing blue in the dim afternoon light. For the first time all day, nobody was staring at her with suspicion. Instead, people were looking at her with growing disbelief. The exhaustion on her face suddenly made sense. The empty coffee cups beside her workstation made sense. The repeated appearances of her credentials throughout the system logs made sense. She had not been creating problems. She had been responding to them. The senior engineer opened another file. This one contained a timeline of automated defensive measures. A low murmur spread through the room. Hundreds of blocked access attempts appeared across the display. Then hundreds more. Each one had been intercepted by temporary security rules. Ethan pointed toward the screen. Who authorized those changes? Nobody answered immediately. Finally, an analyst highlighted a name attached to nearly every action. Alyssa Brooks. Ethan stared at the screen. An intern created all of this. The engineer shook his head. An intern noticed it. Then she protected the network while everyone else was focused on something else. The words landed heavily. Alyssa glanced toward the large windows overlooking the city skyline. Afternoon sunlight reflected against the glass, casting long shadows across the operations floor. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to breathe. Not because the crisis was over. It was not. But because the truth was finally becoming visible. Then another analyst suddenly froze. Wait. Every head turned. He pointed toward a section of the timeline. Look at this. More records appeared. The room became silent again. The timestamps revealed something astonishing. The most serious wave of suspicious activity had occurred during the middle of the previous night. While most of the company slept, someone had repeatedly attempted to reach critical systems. Yet every attempt had been blocked within seconds. The engineer slowly looked toward Alyssa. You were here. Alyssa nodded. All night. The analyst continued reviewing the logs. His eyes widened. If these safeguards had not been active, he stopped speaking. Nobody needed him to finish the sentence. The implication was already obvious. Ethan remained motionless as he stared at the screen. Because for the first time since the crisis began, he was no longer looking at evidence against Alyssa Brooks. He was looking at evidence that she might have been the only reason the company still had a functioning network at all. The realization spread across the operations center slowly at first, then all at once. Employees who had spent the morning searching for someone to blame were now staring at evidence that told a completely different story. The giant displays hanging above the room continued showing network activity, but nobody seemed interested in the alerts anymore. Their attention remained fixed on the timeline Alyssa Brooks had created. The senior engineer expanded another section of the records and projected it onto the largest screen. Hundreds of entries appeared. Every blocked attempt. Every warning. Every emergency response. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Look at the sequence, he said quietly. Analysts leaned forward. Ethan Mercer remained motionless. The engineer highlighted a series of events from the previous night. A cluster of suspicious access attempts appeared shortly after midnight. Seconds later, defensive rules activated. Then another wave arrived. More defensive actions followed. The cycle repeated for hours. Each response occurred before significant damage could occur. Each response carried the same authorization record. Alyssa Brooks. A silence settled over the room. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of understanding. Daniel Price, the company's chief technology officer, had arrived less than 30 minutes earlier after being briefed on the situation. Until now, he had been reviewing reports privately. As he stepped toward the screen, conversations immediately stopped. Daniel was known throughout the company for his technical expertise. If anyone could interpret what the logs truly meant, it was him. He studied the records carefully. Then he opened several additional files that had not yet been examined. More timestamps appeared. More activity logs. More evidence. The deeper he looked, the clearer the picture became. Finally, Daniel turned toward the room. Alyssa was right. The words landed with tremendous force. Ethan looked up. Several executives exchanged stunned glances. Daniel pointed toward the timeline. This was never internal sabotage. He enlarged another section of data. Someone spent days attempting to penetrate critical infrastructure. The room became silent again. Daniel continued. The reason those attempts failed is because defensive measures were already in place before most of us even knew there was a problem. He paused. Then he looked directly at Alyssa. Because she recognized the threat before anyone else. Alyssa lowered her eyes slightly. She looked uncomfortable with the attention. Daniel returned to the screen and revealed the final piece of evidence. A detailed report showed what would have happened if those defensive systems had not been active. Several services could have been disrupted. Sensitive operational systems could have experienced serious problems. the company would have faced enormous challenges. Nobody needed further explanation. The implication was obvious. Ethan slowly sat down in a nearby chair. Throughout the day, he had viewed Alyssa as the source of the crisis. Now every record told the opposite story. The exhausted intern sitting quietly beside a wall of monitors had spent 72 hours protecting systems, while most of the organization remained unaware. Daniel took a slow breath and addressed the room one final time. Everyone keeps asking why her credentials appear everywhere. He pointed toward the screen. Because she was everywhere she needed to be. No one spoke. No one argued. The truth was finally impossible to ignore. And as the operations center absorbed what had really happened during the previous 3 days, Ethan Mercer realized the person he had accused of creating the crisis was actually the person who had prevented it from becoming far worse. The operations center remained quiet long after Daniel Price finished speaking. The truth had finally surfaced, and it carried a weight that nobody could ignore. Screens continued displaying streams of network activity, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Hours earlier, employees had looked at Alyssa Brooks with suspicion. Now they looked at her with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. The exhausted intern sitting beside a cluster of monitors had accomplished something few people in the room fully understood. She had seen the threat before anyone else. She had documented it. She had responded to it. And she had done so while her warnings remained largely unanswered. Ethan Mercer slowly stood from his chair. The confidence that usually defined him had disappeared. In its place was something much rarer. Reflection. He looked across the room toward Alyssa. She was still working. Even after everything that had happened, her attention remained focused on the network. Another alert appeared on one of her screens. She reviewed it calmly, made a few adjustments, and returned to monitoring the system. The simplicity of the moment struck Ethan harder than any report. She was not celebrating. She was not defending herself. She was not demanding recognition. She was simply doing the work. Daniel walked toward Alyssa's workstation and studied the latest activity reports. "How are we looking?" he asked. Alyssa reviewed several entries before answering. "Stable." The room seemed to exhale collectively. It was the first encouraging assessment anyone had heard all day. Daniel nodded. "Good." Then he turned toward the gathered executives. "The network is stabilizing because the defensive measures are holding." Ethan looked at the reports one final time. Every page told the same story. Alyssa had been right from the beginning. More importantly, she had tried repeatedly to tell people what she was seeing. The evidence showed emails, alerts, reports, recommendations, and escalation requests. Everything had been there. Nobody looked closely enough. Ethan finally walked across the operations floor. Employees watched quietly as he stopped beside Alyssa's desk. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan took a slow breath. "I was wrong." The room became completely silent. Alyssa looked up from her monitor. Ethan continued. "I reached conclusions before I understood the facts." His voice was calm but sincere. "And I blamed the one person who was trying to help." Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. Alyssa studied him for a moment. Then she glanced toward the large screen displaying the network timeline. "The information was always there," she said softly. Ethan nodded. The words carried no anger, no bitterness. Somehow that made them even more powerful. Daniel looked around the room. "There is a lesson in this for all of us." Several employees lowered their eyes. They understood exactly what he meant. Expertise does not always arrive with a senior title. Insight does not always come from the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes the person closest to the truth is the person everyone overlooks. As evening sunlight began reflecting against the office windows, the crisis that had dominated the previous 3 days finally seemed to be ending. Yet the most important thing gained during those 72 hours was not technical. It was human. Respect. Recognition. Understanding. Ethan remained beside Alyssa's workstation for a few seconds longer before quietly returning to the executive area. Behind him, the operations center slowly resumed normal activity. But nobody in the room would ever forget what they had learned that day. And the final report Daniel planned to present to the board the next morning would ensure that Alyssa Brooks' role in saving the company would never again be hidden inside a forgotten system log. 6 weeks later, the 23rd floor of the company's headquarters felt very different. The operations center remained filled with screens, dashboards, and streams of live data, but the atmosphere had changed. New security procedures had been implemented. Reporting systems had been redesigned. Technical alerts that once disappeared into crowded inboxes were now reviewed immediately. More importantly, employees had begun listening more carefully to one another. Lessons learned during the crisis had reshaped the company's culture in ways quarterly reports could never fully capture. Early one morning, sunlight poured through the glass walls overlooking the city skyline as engineers prepared for another day. The network was stable. Systems were performing normally. The emergency that had consumed 72 exhausting hours was now part of company history. Yet people still talked about it, not because of the threat itself, but because of what it revealed. Alyssa Brooks arrived carrying a laptop and a cup of coffee. She looked far more rested than she had 6 weeks earlier. The dark circles beneath her eyes had disappeared. Her posture reflected quiet confidence rather than exhaustion. As she walked through the operations floor, employees greeted her warmly. Some nodded. Others stopped briefly to thank her. She accepted every gesture with the same modest smile. Recognition had never been her goal. She simply appreciated being heard. Near the center of the room, a display screen highlighted several recent improvements to the company's security infrastructure. Many of the recommendations came directly from observations Alyssa had documented during those long nights. Yet her name appeared only once in small text near the bottom of the presentation. That seemed perfectly fine with her. Daniel Price stood nearby reviewing system reports when he noticed her arrive. "Good morning," he said. Alyssa smiled. "Good morning." Daniel handed her a folder. Inside was a formal employment offer. Not another internship. A full-time position. Alyssa looked surprised. "You earned this weeks ago," Daniel said. She thanked him quietly. Across the room, Ethan Mercer watched the exchange. The events of that difficult week had changed him as well. He still moved with the confidence of a successful chief executive, but there was something different now. A greater willingness to ask questions before reaching conclusions. A greater respect for information regardless of where it originated. He approached Alyssa and extended his hand. "Congratulations." Alyssa shook it politely. "Thank you." Ethan glanced around the operations center. One report changed everything. Alyssa thought for a moment before responding. "Not really." Ethan looked curious. Alyssa smiled softly. "The facts never changed. People simply started paying attention to them." Ethan nodded. He understood exactly what she meant. Sometimes the truth does not arrive dramatically. Sometimes it sits quietly in plain sight waiting for someone willing to notice it. As the morning continued, employees returned to their projects and meetings. Conversations resumed. Screens glowed. Keyboards clicked. Life moved forward. Alyssa eventually settled into her workstation and opened a new set of security reports. Outside the windows, the city stretched toward the horizon beneath a bright blue sky. Inside, the operations center hummed with quiet purpose. There were no speeches, no celebrations, no dramatic announcements. Just a young cybersecurity professional doing the work she loved. The monitors reflected softly across the glass walls while streams of data moved steadily across her screen. And somewhere among those endless lines of information remained a lesson the company would never forget. The truth had been there from the beginning. The difference was that someone finally chose to see it.